When Russia sent drones into Poland, a line was crossed. For the first time since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian aircraft didn't just menace Ukrainian skies. They slipped into the airspace of a NATO member. Poland was furious, rightly so, because Vladimir Putin keeps pressing buttons and probing responses, maybe as rehearsal for something far larger, a future confrontation with NATO itself. Poland's answer was swift, enough, and Warsaw followed the roar with a surprising slap, one the Kremlin likely didn't anticipate. The call? For NATO to close the skies over Russia's war, in practice, a no-fly zone over Ukraine. On September 15th, the Washington Post reported remarks by Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, Radio Sikorski. In an interview with the German daily Frankfurter Allgemeine, Sikorski argued it's time for NATO to counter the threat from Russia's long-range drones, not just for Ukraine's sake, but for all of Europe. We, as NATO and the EU, might be able to do this, he said. But it's not a decision Poland can take alone. It can only be taken with allies. He added that protecting civilians, for example from falling debris, would be more effective if drones and other airborne threats could be counted beyond Polish territory. Sikorski never uttered the words no-fly zone. He didn't need to. The implication was clear in the scenario he outlined. And from NATO's vantage point, the logic has a hard edge. The ability to down Russian drones in Ukrainian airspace could shield the nations Russia now seems willing to prod along NATO's frontier. Sikorski pushed the point further. If Ukraine asked NATO partners to shoot drones over its territory, that could be beneficial. If you ask me personally, he said, we should consider it. Note the conditional. Only if Kiev requests it. That's an important constraint, because he knows a no-fly zone, NFZ, carries risk for everyone involved. Firing NATO missiles across a border, however carefully coordinated, invites accidents and miscalculation. Any such plan, he signaled, must be a joint effort between Ukraine and NATO. Would Ukraine accept such a proposal? We'll answer that shortly. But first, the question on everyone's mind. Why hasn't anyone done this already? Surely an idea like this, NATO allies neutralizing Russian drones and missiles inside Ukraine, would be a no-brainer for Poland's partners. Sadly, no. Since Russia's 2022 invasion, the notion of an NFZ has surfaced multiple times and each time was firmly rejected. There are reasons. As the Washington Post has noted, NATO resisted because of the risk of direct combat between NATO and Russian aircraft. That risk was likely higher in the early months of the war, when Russia flew manned missions deeper into Ukraine. Today, however, Russia leans on a drone-first strategy. Its crewed jets mostly lob missiles and glide bombs from far behind the lines. That evolution may weaken the old objections, but it doesn't erase them. The UK's House of Commons Library, writing just weeks after Moscow's invasion, laid out precisely what an NFZ involves. The aim is to deny enemy use of airspace, with constant monitoring, airborne surveillance, and, when necessary, combat measures, fighters and missiles to enforce the line. But here's the catch. You need legal authority to draw that line. The library says 3 conditions matter. 1. UN Security Council authorization. Problem: Russia is a permanent member with a veto. Moscow can kill any resolution that authorizes an NFZ over Ukraine, unless the UN changes the rules or finds an extraordinary workaround. This is a brick wall. 2. The NFZ must be justified by individual or collective self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, i.e., there must be an imminent or ongoing threat. Given the war next door, this hurdle is less daunting. 2. Consent of the state whose airspace will be controlled. In other words, Ukraine must agree. We'll come back to this, even if you clear the legal thicket. There's another reality. As the BBC and seasoned commanders remind us, the phrase no-fly zone is not magic. It must be enforced. That means aircraft, ground-based air defenses, tankers, AWACS, crews, logistics, rules of engagement, and political will night after night after night. To be clear, NFZs have been done before, and sometimes without the UN. The US and coalition partners enforced 2 over Iraq after the first Gulf War. An NFZ was imposed over Bosnia in 1992 with UN backing, and over Libya in 2011. In both Bosnia and Libya, NATO was the enforcing muscle. So the very organization that would benefit from an NFZ over Ukraine is also the one that would have to carry it out. So where does that leave us? With two certainties. The NFZ idea has been floated and rejected before. Even if you want one, making it legal and executable is hard. But let's set the legal knots aside for a moment. Has anything changed? Beyond Russia's shift to drones, that might push NATO to revisit an NFZ? Yes, something happened that could force a rethink. On September 10th, Poland shot down suspected Russian drones inside its airspace. Prime Minister Donald Tusk called it the closest moment to an open conflict since World War II, even as he stressed Poland was not on the verge of war with Russia. Still, the breach was unprecedented. Since 2022, Russia had not stepped into a NATO member's sky with drones. Until now, Poland and its allies reacted fast. Warsaw scrambled F-16s. The Dutch launched F-35s. Italy put an AWACS in the air. A NATO tanker ensured everyone could stay aloft as long as needed. When the smoke cleared, Polish authorities reported 19 drones had entered the airspace. At least 3 shot down. Later reporting suggested the devices were decoys, unarmed. But that didn't stop debris from smashing into the roof of Tomasz Wesolowski's house, scattering shattered material across his bedroom. He happened to be downstairs watching the news about the incursion. Irony writes itself. Moscow, predictably, denied involvement. A Russian diplomat in Poland pointed out the drones came from the direction of Ukraine. Of course they did. You can't reach Poland from Russia without crossing Ukraine. That's hardly exculpatory given that Russian drones cross into Ukrainian skies almost daily. Poland quickly requested a UN Security Council meeting, and NATO allies pledged support. The Czech Republic and the Netherlands promised air defense assistance. Germany vowed to intensify its engagement along NATO's eastern flank. France dispatched a trio of Rafales. The United States, after an initially tough statement, signaled concern about Russia's continued boundary testing. That's the point. Many view the drone intrusions as a calculated test, a probe to gauge NATO's reflexes when a member's territory is violated. Sikorsky is among those who think Russia is probing without detonating a casus belli. He noted the drones carried no explosives but could have an ineffective trial balloon designed to stress air defenses while keeping the escalator ladder one rung below open conflict. And Russia wasn't done. Days after the Poland incursion, Romania, another NATO member, reported a Russian drone violation on September 14th. Romanian jets were already up, shadowing an ongoing Russian drone strike on Ukraine. One of Moscow's German drones, the Russian version of Iran's Shad-136, strayed into Romanian airspace, veered to a point roughly 12.4 miles southwest of Chileavesh, and then dropped off radar. No civilians were endangered, Bucharest said. But as Volodymyr Zelensky put it, this looked like an obvious expansion of the war. Accidental? Unlikely. 2 NATO members. 1 week, Russian drones in both skies. That changes the calculus. Up to now, a tacit argument against an NFZ was Ukraine isn't NATO. As long as the drones stayed over Ukraine, the alliance itself wasn't directly threatened. Now it is. Suddenly, the idea of taking Russian drones down before they ever reach NATO borders sounds less like bravado and more like prudence. In response, some NATO states have already moved to quasi-NFZ measures at home. On September 11th, Politico reported that Poland and Latvia were imposing sweeping airspace restrictions along their eastern borders, protective swaths that effectively divert civilian traffic from high-risk corridors. Poland's restrictions took effect at 10 p.m. on September 10th and run to December 9th. Latvia's were shorter. These are not true NFZs. No one plans to fire at civilian planes, but they keep commercial traffic out of lanes where drones might intrude. So what would a real NFZ over Ukraine look like? Suppose the legal barriers vanish and NATO political will aligns. According to multiple defense analyses, effective enforcement would require persistent NATO aviation and air defense, air patrols over Ukrainian skies, constant radar coverage, and readiness to engage not just drones, but also missiles and aircraft. Given the scale of Russia's drone campaign, a credible NFZ might need a layered architecture, especially because it's not just Kiev or cities near Poland that are targeted. If the goal is to reduce Russian drone effectiveness across Ukraine's unoccupied territory, the NFZ would likely be multi-segment and multi-layer. If that's too ambitious, partial zones, prioritizing northern and western Ukraine, could serve as buffers. There have reportedly been discussions among the UK, Turkey, France, and the US about a chain of air defenses acting as a belt against drone incursions. That concept aligns with proposals from policy institutes. Reduce risk of NATO-Russia air-to-air engagements by keeping NATO jets out of Ukrainian skies, while surging ground-based air defenses into Ukraine itself. In effect, Ukraine would operate the physical no-fly umbrella with NATO supply and integration, not NATO pilots inside Ukrainian airspace. Add to that Ukraine's growing fleet of interceptor drones, and you get a model that blunts Russia's drone mass without inviting NATO fighters into direct dogfights. Does that neuter the escalation risk? Not entirely. As security experts warn, a single NATO jet shot down over Ukraine or a NATO air defense battery destroyed on Russian soil could cascade into crisis. Limiting NATO's presence to ground systems in Ukraine and aviation outside Ukraine reduces the probability of such a flashpoint. It also forces the Kremlin to escalate on NATO territory if it wants to retaliate directly, raising the political costs for Moscow. Still, enforcing any NFZ in the drone era has new headaches. Russia's threat profile has evolved. As the New York Times and others have observed, the Kremlin increasingly relies on mass-produced long-range drones rather than high-risk man sorties. That creates a cost exchange nightmare for defenders: expensive missiles versus cheap drones. NATO doesn't want to spend $1 million to kill what costs tens of thousands, or less. Meanwhile, Russia is scaling up production. Ukrainian and regional outlets have reported that Moscow aims to churn out thousands of long-range drones per month, with ambitious targets for surge capacity. Some analyses even warn that Russia's goal is to saturate Ukrainian skies with waves of 1,000 to 2,000 drones in a single night, an industrial tactic designed to overwhelm any fixed number of interceptors. Given that, the best option might be fortifying Ukraine's existing anti-drone network, more mobile short-range air defenses, SHARAD, electronic warfare, directed energy pilot programs, gun-based systems with programmable airburst munitions, and interceptor drones paired with radar EOQing. NATO could also bankroll domestic Ukrainian production of interceptors and sensors to reduce unit costs and keep pace with Russia's volume. Of course, there's the political risk. The Kremlin has already framed any NATO closure of Ukrainian skies as a direct act of war. Dmitry Medvedev and other surrogates issue such threats routinely. The rhetoric isn't new, but it still matters. The specific version of an NFZ suggested by Sikorsky would signal a qualitative escalation. The alliance would be visibly and structurally committed to shooting down Russian aerial assets over Ukraine. It's exactly the narrative Russian state media wants: NATO aggression. And it may be exactly the pretext Putin wants for defensive mobilization at home, which leads to a darker possibility. What if the drone incursions into Poland and Romania were deliberately calibrated to provoke an overcorrection? A handful of unarmed intruders, enough to outrage and alarm, not enough to trigger war, just sufficient to encourage the West across a rhetorical rub icon. If the West bites, the Kremlin gets the propaganda it craves: look, NATO is entering the war. If the West hesitates, Russia learns how much slack it has. Either way, Moscow gets data. So, would Ukraine consent to an NFZ? That's the easiest question here. Yes. From the earliest weeks of the invasion, President Volodymyr Zelensky pleaded for a humanitarian no-fly zone to stop Russia from terrorizing cities by day and night. Ukraine has consistently welcomed any measure that makes its skies safer. Drones may have replaced many of Russia's missile salvos, but the need for air defense hasn't gone away. It has multiplied. An NFZ, if it came with actual enforcement and resources, would help plug one of Kiev's most painful vulnerabilities. But between desire and reality lie obstacles: UN vetoes, escalation risk, cost curves, industrial math, and the political will required to sustain such an operation for months or years. As the NFZ debate reopens, Russia is simultaneously racing to thicken its own air defenses, especially around deep areas and strategic sites. If the skies over Ukraine harden, you can expect the skies over Russia to harden too. So where does that leave NATO and Ukraine now? Option A: full NATO-enforced NFZ over Ukraine. Maximum deterrence, maximum risk, maximum cost. Requires legal ingenuity or collective decision to proceed without UNSC authorization, plus a durable political consensus that outlasts news cycles. Option B: partial regional NFZs buffer belts, focused on northern or western Ukraine to protect NATO borders. Aim to interdict drones before they approach Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. Less comprehensive, still resource-intensive, lower, but not zero, escalation risk. Option C: Ukraine-operated NFZ by capability, NATO supplied. surge ground-based air defenses, EW, interceptor drones, sensors, and C2, with NATO aircraft staying outside Ukrainian airspace. This reduces NATO-Russia air-to-air collision risk, preserves political deniability, and optimizes the cost exchange by using cheaper interceptors and jammers against cheap drones. Option D, hybrid architecture. NATO provides over-the-horizon surveillance, targeting data, refueling, and rapid reaction packages outside Ukraine. Ukraine executes the bulk of engagements. Add airspace restrictions over NATO territory near the border to keep civilian traffic away from hot corridors, as Poland and Latvia have done. None of these paths is painless. All require money, manpower, and political steel. And none eliminates the possibility that a single tragic incident could yank the crisis out of everyone's hands. But after Russian drones slipped into Poland and Romania, the old logic, don't act because the threat is over there, no longer holds. The threat has already touched NATO airspace. The question is whether the alliance chooses a response that is visible and centralized, a classic NFZ, or distributed and deniable, a capability-based shield, and whether that response can scale faster than Russia's drone factories can. For now, the most pragmatic course may be to turbocharge Ukraine's anti-drone ecosystem. More Pantsir-class counters and IRST or Patriot-adjacent interceptors where appropriate, but paired with cheap, abundant short-range solutions. Layered EW to break drone navigation and data links. Gun systems with airburst ammo for low-altitude swarms. Rapid manufacture interceptor drones. Cheap, fast, attritable. Network sensors, radar, EO/IR, acoustic, fused into a common air picture. Hardened critical infrastructure and rapid debris response teams along civilian corridors. Training pipelines to absorb all the above and keep it sustained. If NATO couples that with airspace management along its own frontier, dynamic closures, altitude stratification, quick reaction alert procedures, you get deterrence by resilience. Russia can send the drones, but they won't achieve strategic effect, nor will they bait NATO jets into a trap. And if Kiev formally asks partners to engage inside Ukraine, with clearly delimited ROE and joint command and control, then a targeted, time-bound enforcement window might be possible. A narrow NFZ over specific corridors during known surge periods, synchronized with Ukrainian ground ops. Think of it as procedural air denial rather than a blanket no-fly forever. It's more legally, politically, and logistically digestible, and less likely to hand the Kremlin the narrative victory it seeks. Bottom line, Russia tested defense. Twice. The alarms worked, the patrols scrambled, and the sky held. But the message was plain. Europe's security is not a spectator sport. The war's edges have a way of bleeding outward. Whether through a formal NFZ or a stealthier mesh of capabilities, the choice facing NATO and Ukraine is the same. Either raise the cost of Russian drone warfare now, or pay a larger bill later. In shattered roofs, disrupted corridors, and the erosion of deterrence. We'll keep tracking the legal maneuvers, the military math, and the political weather around this debate. If the shape of a no-fly solution starts to harden, whether classic or hybrid, you'll hear it here first. I'm your host, and this is Global Briefing. Subscribe to Global Briefing for clear, sober coverage of the evolving standoff between NATO and Russia, the realities of Ukraine's air war, and the decisions that will define Europe's security for years to come.